Marcus Reynolds froze mid-stroke, his cleaning cloth suspended above the mahogany conference table. CEO Harrison Blake stood at the head of the room, waving a thick document bound in German corporate blue, and the words that followed carried across the executive floor like a dare wrapped in contempt. Anyone who can translate this merger proposal by tomorrow morning gets my daily salary $50,000 cash. The board members erupted in laughter, sharp and performative, the kind that filled space, but held no joy. Blake's Italian leather shoe nudged Marcus's cleaning cart aside, the metal wheels scraping against polished floor. Blake added his gaze, sliding past Marcus as if he were furniture. If even the janitor can read German, the money's his, too. The laughter followed Marcus into the hallway. He pushed his cart toward the service elevator, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with his pulse. His phone vibrated against his hip. Another text from the hospital, Sophie's cardiologist. The surgery couldn't wait 3 more weeks. Her heart condition was deteriorating faster than projected. They needed $38,000 by Friday, or the experimental procedure would go to the next child on the list. Marcus stepped into the elevator and pulled out his phone. The eviction notice he'd photographed that morning filled the screen. 72 hours. The landlord had finally made good on his threats after 6 months of partial payments. Marcus did the arithmetic again, though he'd done it 100 times already. $50,000 would cover Sophie's surgery, the back rent, and leave enough for 3 months of breathing room. 3 months to figure out what came next. The elevator descended. Marcus studied his reflection in the brushed steel doors, 38 years old. Dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep would erase. The Navy janitor's uniform that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. Once he'd stood in front of lecture halls at Columbia University teaching international business law to students who hung on his every word. Once Rachel had been alive, and Sophie had been a promise growing inside her, and the future had stretched out like a gift they'd barely begun to unwrap. That was 8 years ago, before Harrison Blake destroyed everything. The elevator doors opened onto the basement level. Marcus wheeled his cart toward the supply closet, but his mind stayed 3 floors up, fixed on that German document. He'd caught a glimpse of the cover page. Herstellungs Warenbar manufacturing agreement, technical legal German, the kind that required more than fluency. It required expertise, context, and understanding of how language shaped liability and power across borders. It required someone like him. Marcus unlocked the supply closet and began restocking his cart with paper towels and glass cleaner. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 5 years of night shifts. But his thoughts kept circling back to Blake's offer, to the way the CEO had looked through him, like he was invisible to the laughter of executives, who had no idea that the man emptying their trash cans once held a PhD from MIT and published papers that changed how Fortune 500 companies approached international contracts. They had no idea that Marcus Reynolds understood every word they said, every deal they discussed, every secret they thought was safe, because the janitor didn't speak their language. Except, Marcus spoke 6 languages, and one of them was German. His daughter's face surfaced in his mind. Sophie, at 7 years old, small for her age, with Rachel's dark eyes and his stubborn chin. This morning, she'd asked him why they had to move again. Marcus had knelt beside her bed and promised everything would be okay, even though he had no idea how to make that true. She'd believed him because she was 7, and because he was her father, and because she didn't yet know that the world broke promises like it broke people. But Marcus knew. He'd learned 8 years ago when Blake had accused him of corporate espionage, fabricated evidence of plagiarism, and blacklisted him across every university and consulting firm in the country. He'd learned when Rachel went into early labor from the stress of watching her husband's career implode. He'd learned when she'd bled out on the operating table, while Sophie entered the world 3 months too soon, her tiny heart already damaged by the trauma of her birth. Marcus had learned that speaking up came with a cost. That integrity was a luxury. That sometimes the truth destroyed more than it saved. He closed the supply closet and checked the time. 10:30 at night. The executive floor would be empty now, except for Blake, who never went home before midnight, and maybe 1 or 2 workaholics trying to prove themselves. Marcus could go up there, He could photograph that document with his phone. He could spend the night translating it in secret, the way he'd been doing freelance work online for the past 5 years under a username that kept him anonymous and safe. He could try to save his daughter without revealing himself. The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor. The executive wing stretched out before him, all glass walls and recessed lighting and the kind of silence that money bought. Marcus moved through it like a ghost, his cartwheels muffled by carpet that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, he could see Derek Vaughn, the VP of Strategy, hunched over the German document with his phone in one hand and a defeated expression on his face. Marcus had heard the executives talking earlier. Vaughn had studied abroad in Berlin during his MBA. He'd assured Blake he could handle the translation, could get the gist of it, even if he missed some nuances. Now Vaughn looked like a man realizing that gist wasn't going to cut it. The document sat in the center of the conference table. 45 pages of dense legal and technical language. Marcus could see the Schneider Industries logo on the cover. He knew the company. They manufactured hydraulic systems, precision engineering components, the kind of work that required contracts written with surgical precision, because a single mistranslated clause could shift millions of dollars in liability. Vaughn looked up. His eyes passed over Marcus without seeing him. "Still here," he said, his voice distracted. "Thought you left at 10. "Cleaning the executive restrooms," Marcus said, keeping his voice flat and his eyes down. "Scheduled deep clean night." "Well, don't interrupt. I'm working on something important." Van turned back to his phone, squinting at whatever translation app he'd pulled up. Marcus moved past the conference room toward the restrooms at the end of the hall. But he kept the glass wall in his peripheral vision, kept watching as Van scribbled notes on a legal pad, crossing things out, starting over. The man was drowning, and when he went under, he'd take the deal with him, and Blake would miss the deadline, and Schneider Industries would walk away and take their $340 million contract to a company that knew what they were doing. And none of that would matter to Marcus except that Blake had put $50,000 on the table, except that Sophie needed surgery in 5 days, except that the arithmetic of desperation had a way of overriding everything else, including pride, including fear, including the memory of what happened the last time Marcus Reynolds tried to help Harrison Blake navigate an international contract. He finished cleaning the restrooms and wheeled his cart back toward the elevator. But as he passed the conference room, something on Van's legal pad caught his eye. The man had written, "Haas equals shared responsibility." Marcus' hands tightened on the cart handle. Haftung didn't mean shared responsibility. It meant liability, exclusion, complete immunity from legal consequences. Translating it wrong would expose Apex Financial to lawsuits that could destroy the company. Van was about to hand Blake a contract that promised the opposite of what it actually delivered. The elevator doors opened. Marcus stepped inside. The doors began to close. His hand shot out, stopping them. He stood there, suspended between floors, between choices, between the man he used to be and the invisible one he'd become. Rachel's voice surfaced in his memory, the last thing she'd said to him before the surgery, before everything went wrong. "Your voice matters, Marcus. Don't let them take that from you." But they had taken it. Blake had taken it. And now, Blake was offering him $50,000 to use that voice again. Not knowing who Marcus was, not remembering the professor he'd destroyed, not recognizing that the janitor standing in his building spoke fluent German, and understood every clause in that contract, and could finish the translation in 20 hours. If he didn't sleep, and didn't eat, and poured everything he had into the work the way he used to, when he still believed that expertise and integrity meant something. The elevator doors tried to close again. Marcus kept his hand on the sensor, holding them open. Sophie needed surgery. He needed rent money. He needed to not be invisible anymore, even if visibility meant risk. He stepped back into the hallway and pulled out his phone, opened the camera. The conference room was empty now. Vaughn must have given up and gone home. The German document sat abandoned on the table, its pages catching the overhead light. Marcus moved closer to the glass wall. He couldn't go inside without triggering questions. Janitors didn't need access to conference rooms, but he could photograph the document from here if he pressed the camera against the glass. If the angle was right, if he was very, very careful. He raised his phone. Through the camera lens, the German text came into focus. Technical terminology, legal frameworks, clauses about workforce optimization and pension obligations, and intellectual property rights. The kind of language that determined whether 450 manufacturing workers kept their jobs or ended up on the street with nothing but severance packages that wouldn't cover 3 months of rent. Marcus took the first photograph, then another, page by page, working quickly, checking over his shoulder every few seconds to make sure he was still alone. He was halfway through when footsteps echoed down the hallway. Marcus lowered his phone and grabbed his cleaning cloth, began wiping down the glass wall like he'd been doing it all along. The footsteps grew closer. Blake rounded the corner. His tie loosened, his suit jacket slung over one arm. He looked exhausted, stressed, like a man who just realized his company's biggest deal in 5 years was about to collapse because his VP of strategy couldn't tell the difference between liability, exclusion, and shared responsibility. Blake stopped when he saw Marcus. "You're still here." "Deep clean night, sir." Marcus kept his eyes on the glass, his cloth moving in slow circles. "The conference room, is Vaughn still in there?" "Left about 10 minutes ago, sir." Blake swore under his breath. He stared through the glass at the abandoned document, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite desperation, not quite panic, but close enough to both that Marcus could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The deadline, the money, the gap between what he needed and what he had. "You ever learn a foreign language?" Blake asked suddenly. Marcus's hand stilled on the glass. "Sir, German, Spanish, anything." Blake was looking at him now, really looking like he'd suddenly remembered the janitor was human. "I need someone who can read that document by morning, and Van's useless." The moment stretched between them. Marcus could feel his pulse in his throat. This was the question. This was the offer. This was Blake handing him $50,000 and an opportunity and a loaded gun all wrapped up together. "I know some Spanish," Marcus said carefully. "Picked it up working construction before this job, but not German, sir." "Sorry." Blake's expression closed. The moment of possibility vanished. "Right. Of course not. Get back to work." "Yes, sir." Blake walked away. Marcus waited until the footsteps faded, until the elevator dinged and carried the CEO back down to whatever life he had outside this building. Then Marcus raised his phone again and finished photographing the document. He had what he needed, 45 pages of German text that he could translate in his apartment tonight while Sophie slept. He could do it anonymously. Leave the translation on Van's desk before dawn, signed with a fake name or no name at all. Let Blake think his VP had pulled off a miracle. Let the deal go through. Collect the $50,000 without ever revealing who he was or what he could do. It was the safe choice, the invisible choice. But as Marcus rode the elevator down to the basement, as he clocked out and walked to the parking lot where his 15-year-old Honda waited under a broken streetlight, as he drove home through empty streets to the one-bedroom apartment he shared with his daughter, he couldn't shake the feeling that safe and invisible had stopped being enough, that Sophie deserved a father who didn't hide, that Rachel's last words, "Your voice matters," meant something more than just survival. The apartment was dark when he arrived. His neighbor, Mrs. Carter, sat on the couch reading by lamplight. She looked up when Marcus entered. "Sophie's asleep," she said softly. "No problems tonight, but the hospital called. They need an answer by tomorrow about the surgery date. I'll call them in the morning." Marcus paid Mrs. Carter from the thin fold of bills in his wallet. $20 he couldn't afford but needed to spend, because daycare cost more, and he couldn't leave a 7-year-old alone. After Mrs. Carter left, Marcus checked on Sophie. She lay curled under the covers, her breathing steady, but too fast the way it always was now. Her heart working harder than it should, running out of time in increments too small to see but too real to ignore. He kissed her forehead and moved to the Kit Carter table, pulled out his phone, and opened the photographs of the German document. The text stared back at him, dense and technical, and worth $50,000 to anyone who could translate it correctly. Marcus picked up a pen, not just any pen, the jade-handled Mont Blanc that Rachel had given him on their 5th anniversary, engraved with the words, "Your voice matters." He'd carried it every day since she died. A reminder, a promise, a weight he couldn't put down. He opened his laptop and began to type. The first section dealt with manufacturing specifications, technical language that required understanding of hydraulic systems, precision tolerances, quality control protocols. Marcus had spent 6 months consulting on a similar contract 8 years ago before Blake destroyed his career. He knew this vocabulary, knew the patterns, knew where the trapdoors were hidden in syntax that looked simple but shifted meaning with a single mistranslated preposition. Vaughn had written MIDAR up to Miron as employee optimization programs, but the actual translation was workforce reduction measures. Not improvement, not development, reduction, as in layoffs, as in 450 people losing their jobs as a condition of the deal. Marcus typed the correct translation and kept going. The work pulled him in the way it used to. The way it did when he still believed language was about precision and truth rather than survival. Hours passed. The coffee pot emptied. His eyes burned. But the translation grew page by page, clause by clause, until he could see the shape of what Schneider Industries was actually offering. It wasn't as bad as Vaughn's mistranslation suggested, but it wasn't good either. The workforce reductions were optional, not required. But the pension obligations were being terminated, and the liability exclusions were one-sided. And there was a non-compete clause buried in Section 7 that would prevent laid-off workers from finding jobs in their industry for 3 years. Marcus sat back and rubbed his eyes. This was why Blake had hired him 8 years ago to catch these things, to protect the company from contracts that looked favorable on the surface but hid consequences in the fine print. Marcus had done his job. He'd warned Blake that the German automotive manufacturer was trying to strip Apex's patent rights through deliberate mistranslation, and Blake had thanked him by destroying his career. The sky outside the Kit Carter window was starting to lighten. Marcus checked the time. 5:30 inches the morning. He'd been working for 6 hours. He was maybe 30% through the document, and he needed to get Sophie ready for school in 90 minutes. And he hadn't slept. And $50,000 felt like both a fortune and a trap he couldn't quite see the edges of. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Final reminder, surgery deposit due Friday at noon. Without it, they'd move Sophie to standby status, which meant she'd only get the procedure if someone else canceled, which meant she might not get it at all. Marcus stared at the German text on his screen, at the jade pen resting beside his laptop, at the photograph of Rachel he kept on the Kit Carter counter, the one where she was laughing at something. He'd set her hand on her pregnant belly, the future still intact between them. He picked up the pen and kept translating. By 7, he'd finished another 20 pages. By 8, Sophie was awake and eating cereal while he made her lunch. She asked him why he looked tired. He said he'd been working on something important. She asked if it was going to help them. He said yes, even though he didn't know if he was lying. He drove her to school, then returned to the apartment and collapsed on the couch for 2 hours of sleep. That felt like drowning. When he woke, it was almost 11. He had 9 hours until his shift started at Apex Financial. 9 hours to finish the translation or abandon it. 9 hours to decide whether $50,000 was worth becoming visible again. He chose visibility. By 3, he'd completed 85% of the document. The work was good, better than good. He'd included footnotes explaining technical context, cross-references to German corporate law notes about clauses that needed clarification before signing. This wasn't just translation. It was analysis. The kind of expertise that used to make him valuable. The kind that cost Blake $85,000 when they worked together. The kind that got him destroyed when he tried to use it honestly. Marcus saved the file and emailed it to himself. Then he opened a blank document and began writing a second version. Simpler, stripped of his footnotes and analysis. Just the raw translation, adequate but unremarkable. The kind of work that could have come from anyone with decent German and a good dictionary. He saved both versions, put on his janitor's uniform, drove to Apex Financial. The executive floor was busy when he arrived. Voices carried from the conference room. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart past the glass walls and saw them gathered around the table. Blake Vaughn, the CFO, a handful of board members. Vaughn was presenting something on a screen. The German document sat in front of Blake, covered in handwritten notes. Marcus kept moving, turned the corner, stopped where he could listen without being seen. The translation's rough, Vaughn was saying, but I got the key points. Schneider's offering exclusive manufacturing rights at 15% below market rate. Minimal oversight on quality control. Standard workforce optimization language. We can restructure as needed without penalty. The CFO spoke up. That's better than expected. What's the catch? No catch. They're eager to break into the American market. This is their way in. Marcus' hands tightened on the cleaning cart handle. Every word Vaughn had just said was wrong. 15% below market rate was actually 15% higher quality tolerance standards. Minimal oversight was actually stringent quality control protocols. Standard workforce optimization was actually mandatory reduction of 450 positions. Vaughn had mistranslated the entire contract, and Blake was about to sign it. Marcus stood there, listening to executives who had no idea they were discussing fiction. He could walk away, finish his shift, let the deal go through. Let Blake discover his mistake when Schneider's lawyer started enforcing clauses that didn't match Van's translation. Let 450 workers lose their jobs. Let Apex Financial drown in lawsuits that were entirely preventable. He could stay invisible and collect $50,000 and save Sophie and tell himself that none of this was his problem anymore. Or he could walk into that conference room and correct Vaughn in front of the board and watch what happened when Harrison Blake realized his janitor spoke fluent German and had once been the professor he'd destroyed. Marcus's phone vibrated. Another text from the hospital, this one with a photo attached. Sophie, in her hospital gown, smiling for the camera, despite the IV in her arm. The cardiologist had kept her for observation after she'd collapsed at school. Routine, they said, precautionary. But Marcus knew what routine meant when your daughter had 3 months to live without surgery. He looked at the photograph, at Sophie's smile, at the way she tried to be brave even though she was 7 years old and scared and didn't understand why her heart didn't work right, or why they had to keep moving, or why her father came home every night smelling like disinfectant and defeat. Rachel's voice again, clear as morning. Your voice matters. Marcus pushed his cart back around the corner. Through the glass wall, he could see Vaughn still presenting Blake, still nodding the board members, still discussing a contract that didn't exist in the form they believed. He pulled out his phone, opened the good translation, the one with footnotes and analysis, and 8 years of expertise packed into 45 pages. He hit print and sent it to the executive floor's main printer. Then he walked into the conference room. The conversation stopped. Every head turned. Blake looked up from the document with an expression that started as irritation and ended somewhere closer to confusion. We're in the middle of something. I know, sir. Marcus's voice was steady, but Mr. Van's translation is wrong. The silence that followed was absolute. Van stared at Marcus, like he'd grown a second head. The CFO leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Blake sat down his pen very carefully, the way people did when they were deciding whether to be amused or angry. I'm sorry, Blake said slowly. Did the janitor just interrupt my board meeting to critique my VP's work? The translation is wrong, Marcus repeated. Half-tongue Schluss doesn't mean shared responsibility. It means complete liability exclusion. If you sign this contract based on Mr. Van's translation, Schneider Industries will own your intellectual property rights within 6 months, and you'll face $200 million in wrongful termination lawsuits when you try to lay off the workers. You think this contract allows you to fire? Van shot to his feet. How dare you sit down? Blake's voice cut through the room like a blade. His eyes hadn't left Marcus. You speak German? I speak 6 languages. Marcus met Blake's gaze and held it. German, French, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, and English. all fluently. I also have a PhD in international business law from MIT and 15 years of experience translating contracts exactly like this one." The words hung in the air. Marcus watched realization move across Blake's face in stages. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "Reynolds," Blake said softly. "Marcus Reynolds, the professor from Columbia. The one you accused of corporate espionage 8 years ago. The one you destroyed." "Yes, sir. That's me." The board members erupted in overlapping voices. Questions, objections, demands for explanation. But Blake raised one hand, and the room fell silent again. He stood slowly, deliberately, the way powerful men did when they wanted everyone to remember who controlled the space. "You've been working here for," Blake checked his phone, pulling up something on the screen. "5 years as a janitor." "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because no university would hire me after you blacklisted me. Because my wife died during early labor, brought on by the stress of watching her husband's career implode. Because my daughter was born with a heart defect that needs surgery I can't afford. Because janitor jobs don't require background checks or professional references. Because I needed health insurance and a paycheck, and I didn't have the luxury of pride." Blake absorbed this without expression. "And now you're here telling me my VP can't do his job. I'm here telling you that if you sign this contract based on Mr. Vaughn's translation, you'll lose $340 million and destroy 450 families in the process." Marcus pulled the jade pen from his pocket and set it on the conference table. "I can give you an accurate translation by 9 tomorrow morning. The one you need. The one that will save this deal and protect your workers and keep Schneider's lawyers from owning your company." "That was your offer, wasn't it? $50,000 to anyone who could translate the document." "That offer was a joke." "Then I guess we're both comedians, sir." Marcus turned to leave. "I'll be at my desk in the basement if you change your mind. The good translation is printing right now. 45 pages with footnotes and analysis. You can use it or throw it away, but you should know that Mr. Vaughn's version will bankrupt your company, and mine won't." He walked out of the conference room, made it halfway to the elevator before Blake's voice followed him. "Reynolds, stop." Marcus stopped, but didn't turn around. Blake's footsteps approached. "You have every reason to let me sign that contract and hang myself." "I do." "So, why help?" Marcus finally turned. Blake stood 3 feet away, and for the first time in 8 years, he looked like something other than the man who destroyed Marcus's life. He looked tired, scared, human. "Because 450 workers don't deserve to lose their jobs because you're too proud to admit you need help," Marcus said. "Because my daughter's surgery costs $38,000 and I need the $50,000 you offered. Because my wife told me my voice mattered, and I've spent 8 years proving her wrong. And because I'm tired of being invisible." Blake studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and typed something. Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A contract written by Blake's lawyers. Binding $50,000 for accurate translation delivered by 9 tomorrow morning. Employment protection regardless of outcome. Access to company legal team for insurance appeal. "You have 18 hours, Blake said. "Don't make me regret this." "You already regret it, sir. You've regretted it for 8 years. But regret doesn't pay my daughter's medical bills, so I'll take the contract anyway." Marcus rode the elevator down to the basement, retrieved the good translation from the printer, carried it back to his apartment while Sophie was still at Mrs. Carter's for the evening. He worked through dinner, worked through midnight, worked through the exhaustion that made his vision blur and his hands shake. At 3:00 the morning, Derek Vaughn appeared in Marcus's doorway. He must have gotten the address from employee records. He stood there in his expensive suit, looking at the one-bedroom apartment with its peeling paint and its used furniture, and something like satisfaction moved across his face. "You won't finish in time," Van said. Marcus didn't look up from his laptop. "Yes, I will. Blake's setting you up. He's going to fire you either way for being the professor he destroyed or for failing the translation. You're not walking out of this building with $50,000. Maybe not, but I'll walk out with my voice." Van stepped into the apartment. "I know about your daughter, about the surgery, About the eviction notice. He pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a screenshot. Social services report dated tomorrow, claiming Marcus was an unfit parent, unstable employment, history of fraud, living in substandard housing. You file that translation, Van said quietly. And I file this, and Sophie goes into foster care while they investigate. Is your pride worth that? Marcus set down his J pen, looked at Vaughn for the first time since he'd arrived. You know what's interesting about people like you? You think everyone operates from fear. You can't imagine someone choosing integrity over safety because you never have. So, you threaten. You manipulate. You assume the threat will work because it always has before. I'm not threatening. I'm promising. Then here's my promise. Marcus stood. He was taller than Vaughn, not by much, but enough. You file that report, and I'll make sure every board member at Apex Financial knows you deliberately mistranslated a $340 million contract. I'll show them the security footage of you sabotaging my work tonight because yes, the building has cameras, and yes, I made copies. I'll demonstrate in front of Schneider Industries exactly how badly you butchered their language. And then I'll watch your career implode the way mine did 8 years ago. Except you'll deserve it. Van's face went pale. You're bluffing. Try me. They stood there, locked in the kind of silence that preceded either violence or surrender. Vaughn chose surrender. He backed toward the door, his expensive shoes catching on the uneven carpet. You're making a mistake. I've made a lot of mistakes. This isn't one of them. After Van left, Marcus returned to his laptop. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of finally refusing to be small. He worked through dawn, worked through the alarm that told him to wake Sophie, worked through Mrs. Carter's arrival, and Sophie's questions about why Daddy looked so tired. At 8:30, Marcus saved the completed translation, 47 pages, including his additions. Perfect, comprehensive, worth every penny of $50,000, and then some. Clear his throat, he showered, put on the one suit he still owned from his Columbia days. It was 8 years out of style and tight in the shoulders, but it was better than his janitor's uniform, better than invisible. At 8:45, he arrived at Apex Financial's executive floor. Blake's assistant tried to stop him. Dress code violation, unauthorized access. But Blake's office door opened before security could arrive. Let him in, Blake said. Marcus walked into an office he'd only ever cleaned. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. Mahogany desk that cost more than Marcus's annual salary. Photographs of Blake with senators and CEOs, and people who shaped policy with phone calls. Blake sat behind his desk. Vaughn stood beside him, arms crossed. The CFO and 2 board members occupied the leather chairs facing Blake's desk. You're early, Blake said. I finished at 8:30. Marcus set the translation on Blake's desk. 47 pages, footnotes, explaining technical context, cross-references to German corporate law, analysis of every clause that needs clarification before signing. You'll find that Schneider Industries is offering a good deal, but not the one Mr. Vaughn described. The workforce reductions are optional, not required. The quality control oversight is stringent, not minimal. The cost savings are real, but so are the performance standards. This is a partnership contract, not a permission slip. Blake picked up the translation, began reading. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. Marcus watched him shift from skeptical to focused to something that looked like grudging respect. This is Blake stopped, started again. This is exceptional work. It's the work you hired me to do 8 years ago before you decided to destroy me instead of listening to me. Van stepped forward. He's lying. I checked his credentials. The plagiarism charges are real. The corporate espionage allegations are documented. He's a fraud who's trying to shut up, Blake said, not looking away from the translation. Just shut up, Derek. The CFO spoke. How do we verify this is accurate? Call Schneider Industries, Marcus said. Ask to speak with Dr. Klaus Schneider, personally. Tell him you have questions about the half-dose clause on page 16. If he's impressed that you pronounced it correctly and understood the nuance, you'll know the translation is good. If he's confused because Mr. Vaughn's version made it sound like you wanted complete immunity from legal consequences. You'll know I'm right. Blake picked up his phone, dialed, put it on speaker. The call connected. German voices, professional, courteous. Then a man's voice, older, authoritative. This is Dr. Schneider. Dr. Schneider, this is Harrison Blake from Apex Financial. We're reviewing the Haften-Exo-Schluss clause and wanted to clarify the liability exclusion provisions before we proceed. A pause. Then, Mr. Blake, I'm impressed. Most American executives struggle with that pronunciation. Have you found someone who understands technical German? Blake looked at Marcus. We have. Yes. Excellent. May I speak with them? There are several nuances in the contract that require expertise to navigate properly. Blake handed Marcus the phone. Dr. Schneider, this is Marcus Reynolds. I've completed the translation and analysis of your proposal. Another pause, longer this time. Then Marcus Reynolds, not the Marcus Reynolds who published cross-border legal language frameworks in the International Journal of Business Law. The same Mr. Blake, do you have any idea what kind of asset you have on your team, Dr. Reynolds's work on linguistic precision in corporate contracts is legendary. We use his framework in our legal department. Schneider's voice warmed with enthusiasm. Dr. Reynolds, I have questions about 3 specific clauses. Are you available for a video call in 30 minutes? Marcus looked at Blake. Blake looked at the translation on his desk, then at Vaughn, whose face had gone from pale to gray, then back at Marcus. He's available, Blake said. The video call lasted 90 minutes. Marcus sat in Blake's office with the board members and walked Dr. Schneider through every clause in the contract, answering questions in fluent German, explaining nuances that even Schneider's own legal team hadn't caught. Vaughn stood in the corner, forgotten, watching his career dissolve in real time. When the call ended, Schneider made one final request. Mr. Blake, I insist that Dr. Reynolds oversee the implementation of this contract as our cultural liaison. His understanding of both German corporate law and American business practice is invaluable. Consider it a condition of the deal. Blake ended the call. The office fell silent, except for the traffic noise filtering through the windows. Blake sat back in his chair and studied Marcus, like he was a problem that had just rewritten itself. You could have let me sign Van's version, Blake said finally. You could have watched me lose $340 million. After what I did to you, I would have deserved it. You would have, Marcus agreed. But 450 workers wouldn't have, and my daughter needs surgery, not revenge. Blake pulled out his checkbook, wrote something, signed it, handed it across the desk. $50,000. Marcus stared at the check. It was real. The amount was real. The signature was real. 8 years of invisibility ending in a single piece of paper. Schneider's cultural liaison position pays $75,000, Blake said, plus benefits, plus oversight of the implementation team. That's a separate contract separate from this. He gestured at the check. You earned both. Marcus folded the check and put it in his pocket. And the plagiarism charges, the blacklist, the lies you told that destroyed my career. Blake's expression hardened. Those were don't. Marcus's voice was quiet, steady. Don't tell me they were justified. Don't tell me you were protecting the company. Don't make this worse by lying to my face when we both know what you did. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The CFO looked at Blake with something like disappointment. Blake seemed to age a decade in the silence that followed. I made a mistake, Blake said finally. I prioritized short-term profit over long-term integrity. I destroyed a good man's career because he threatened a deal I wanted, and I've regretted it every day since. Not because I'm a good person, but because I'm a smart businessman, and smart businessmen don't throw away assets like you. That's not an apology. No, it's not, because an apology implies I can fix what I broke, and I can't give you back 8 years. Can't bring back your wife. Can't undo what happened to your daughter. All I can do is offer you money and a job and a public statement clearing your name. Marcus stood. The check felt heavy in his pocket. That'll do for now. He turned to leave. Blake's voice stopped him at the door. "Reynolds, why did you come back? After everything I did to you, why walk into this building and take a job cleaning my floors?" Marcus looked back. Blake sat behind his enormous desk, surrounded by wealth and power, and photographs of himself with important people. And for the first time, Marcus saw what he should have seen 8 years ago. A man who traded integrity for success and discovered too late that the trade had cost him something essential. "Because I needed health care for my daughter," Marcus said. "Because janitor jobs don't ask questions about gaps in employment. And because I wanted to see if you'd recognize me, if you'd remember the man you destroyed. But you never looked at me, not once, in 5 years. Because people like you don't see people like me. We're invisible until you need us. And then suddenly we matter. And now I'm taking your money and your job and your public apology. And I'm going to save my daughter, and I'm going to help those 450 workers keep their jobs. And I'm going to do all of that while being very, very visible." Marcus walked out of Blake's office, took the elevator down to the lobby, called the hospital from his car, and told them to schedule Sophie's surgery for Friday. Yes, he had the deposit. Yes, he was sure. Then he called Mrs. Carter and asked her to bring Sophie to the hospital. He had something to tell his daughter. Something about second chances and speaking up in voices that mattered even when the world tried to silence them. Sophie was in the hospital playroom when Marcus arrived. She looked up from her coloring book and smiled, and Marcus saw Rachel in that smile. Saw the future they'd almost lost. Saw the possibility of healing. "Daddy, you're wearing your fancy suit. I had an important meeting." Clear his throat. "Did it go good?" Marcus knelt beside her chair, pulled out the check, and showed it to her. "What do you see?" Sophie studied the numbers. She could count to 100, but 50,000 was beyond her. "Is it a lot?" "It's enough. Enough for your surgery. Enough for a new apartment. Enough for us to stop running. Because of your meeting. Because I stopped being invisible." Sophie didn't understand, but she didn't need to. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight. And Marcus held her back and thought about Rachel's last words and Blake's mistakes and the difference between surviving and living. That afternoon, Marcus resigned from his janitor position, signed the contract as Schneider Industries' cultural liaison, started the paperwork to clear his name with Columbia University, called his old colleagues, and told them he was back, not as the disgraced professor, as the man who'd been right all along. On Friday, Sophie went into surgery at 7 inches the morning. 4 hours later, the surgeon came out and said the procedure was successful. Her heart would need monitoring, but she'd live. She'd grow up. She'd have a future that included more than hospital visits and eviction notices, and a father who smelled like disinfectant. Marcus sat in the waiting room and cried for the first time since Rachel died. Not from grief, from relief, from the weight of 8 years lifting all at once. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a conference room at Schneider Industries' New York office. The partnership with Apex Financial had exceeded projections. The manufacturing deal had created 600 new jobs instead of eliminating 450. Marcus's framework for cross-cultural contract implementation was being adopted across the industry, and Derek Vaughn was teaching basic German at a community college in New Jersey. Marcus's apartment now had 2 bedrooms and windows that didn't leak. Sophie's medical bills were paid. Her health was stable. She'd started asking questions about her mother, who she was, what she liked, how she died. Marcus answered honestly, told her about the scandal and the stress and the choices that had consequences. Sophie listened the way 7-year-olds did, absorbing information without fully understanding it. Then she said, "Mommy would be proud of you." "Why do you think that?" "Because you didn't stay quiet. You used your voice like she wanted." Marcus looked at his daughter and saw the person she'd become. Strong, thoughtful, unafraid to ask hard questions. Everything Rachel had hoped for. Everything Marcus had almost lost. On Sophie's 8th birthday, Marcus took her to Columbia University, showed her the building where he used to teach, the lecture hall where students had once listened to him, explain how language shaped power across borders, the office where he'd worked before. "Blake destroyed everything. This is where you were invisible," Sophie asked. No, this is where I was loud, where I thought my voice mattered. It does matter. I know that now. They walked through campus, holding hands. Sophie asked questions about his research, his teaching, his students. Marcus answered them all, and as they walked, he felt Rachel walking beside them, her presence not in memory, but in the life they'd built from the pieces she'd left behind. The jade pen stayed in Marcus's pocket. Some days he used it to sign contracts. Some days he used it to help Sophie with homework. But every day he carried it, a reminder that voices mattered, that invisibility was a choice. That silence had a cost higher than any salary. That speaking up might destroy you, but staying silent destroyed you slower. And there were worse things than losing everything, like never having tried to save it. Harrison Blake sent a formal letter of apology 6 months after Marcus started at Schneider Industries. It was written by lawyers, carefully worded to avoid liability, empty of anything resembling genuine remorse. Marcus read it once and threw it away. Some things couldn't be fixed with words. Some damage was permanent. But Blake had cleared Marcus' name, had published the truth about the plagiarism charges, had admitted the corporate espionage allegations were false, had given Marcus his reputation back even if he couldn't give him 8 years. It was enough. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The world now knew that Marcus Reynolds had been right, that integrity had cost him everything, that he'd paid the price and survived and emerged stronger for it. On the anniversary of Rachel's death, Marcus took Sophie to the cemetery. They brought flowers, sat on the grass beside the headstone. Sophie was 8, now old enough to remember her mother in photographs, if not in person. Old enough to understand that the woman in the pictures had loved her, had died bringing her into the world, had left behind words that mattered. Your voice matters, Daddy, Sophie said quietly. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy knows about the surgery and the new apartment and your job? Marcus looked at Rachel's headstone, at the dates that marked a life cut short, at the flowers they'd brought that would wilt and die and need replacing, at the permanence of loss and the persistence of love. I think she knows, he said. I think she's known all along. They sat there until the sun began to set. Then Marcus stood and helped Sophie to her feet, and they walked back to their car, back to their apartment with 2 bedrooms and windows that didn't leak, back to their life that included enough money for groceries and enough time for homework and enough space for healing. Marcus drove home slowly. Sophie fell asleep in the passenger seat. He carried her inside and tucked her into bed and stood in her doorway watching her breathe, her heart beating steady, her future unfolding, her voice waiting to be discovered. And Marcus thought about all the invisible people in the world, the janitors, and the security guards, and the cafeteria workers, who spoke 6 languages, and held advanced degrees, and cleaned floors, because the world had decided their voices didn't matter. He thought about starting a foundation, about creating opportunities, about making sure that what happened to him didn't happen to others. He thought about legacy, about what Rachel would want, about what Sophie deserved to inherit. The jade pen sat on his desk, catching the light from the hallway. Marcus picked it up and read the engraving one more time. Your voice matters. 3 words that had saved his life. 3 words that could save others. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not a translation, not a contract, a mission statement for a foundation that would help invisible people become visible, that would give second chances to those who'd been destroyed for speaking truth, that would turn silence into sound and invisibility into presence. He named it the Rachel Reynolds Foundation for Voice, for integrity, for the courage to speak even when speaking cost everything. The work took months: fundraising, paperwork, building a board, finding people who believed that voices mattered and were willing to invest in proving it. But by Sophie's 9th birthday, the foundation was real. By her 10th, it had helped 40 people find jobs that matched their expertise. By her 11th, it had cleared the names of 12 professionals who'd been blacklisted for refusing to compromise their integrity. And Marcus Reynolds, who'd spent 8 years invisible, became known as the man who made others visible, the professor who'd survived destruction, the janitor who'd saved a company, the father who taught his daughter that voices mattered. Sophie grew up strong and healthy. Her heart repaired, her future bright. She asked questions about her mother, about integrity and courage and the cost of speaking truth. Marcus answered honestly, never sugarcoating the pain, never pretending the world was fair, but always emphasizing that silence was worse than suffering. On Sophie's 18th birthday, Marcus gave her the jade pen, the one Rachel had given him, the one that said, "Your voice matters." Sophie held it carefully, understanding the weight of what she had inherited. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "You use it," Marcus said. "You speak. You refuse to be invisible. You remember that your mother died believing voices mattered, and you make sure she was right." Sophie went to college, studied international law, followed her father's path, but made it her own, used her voice to speak for others who couldn't speak for themselves, became exactly the person Rachel had hoped she'd be. And Marcus watched his daughter grow and remembered the night he'd stood in Apex Financial's conference room and refused to stay silent. Remembered the choice between invisibility and risk. Remembered the moment he'd picked up his jade pen and decided that survival wasn't enough. That Sophie deserved a father who spoke. That Rachel's last words weren't just encouragement, but prophecy. Your voice matters. It always had. It always would. And Marcus had spent 8 years learning that lesson the hard way so his daughter wouldn't have to. The foundation grew. The contracts multiplied. The opportunities expanded. And somewhere in a cemetery beside a headstone that marked a life cut short, flowers kept appearing, fresh ones every week, brought by a man who'd learned that love persisted, and voices mattered, and invisibility was always a choice. Marcus Reynolds chose visibility, chose voice, chose to teach his daughter that silence was expensive and courage was worth the cost. And some things, integrity, truth, love, were worth losing everything to protect. And in the end, he didn't lose everything. He gained something better. He gained his voice back and used it to help others find theirs. That was enough. That was everything. That was the legacy Rachel had left and Marcus had protected and Sophie would carry forward. Your voice matters. 3 words, 1 truth. The difference between invisible and seen, between silent and heard, between surviving and living. Marcus chose living and taught his daughter to do the